deals with the conversion of food that's on our plates and such into nutrients. And that's the whole goal. We want to take the food, whatever it is that you had on your plate for dinner or for breakfast this morning if you ate breakfast, and we want to convert it into the nutrients. And we're going to actually do this by two means. There are mechanical mechanisms that are going to allow us to convert, but there's also going to be chemical mechanisms. So we will have mechanical and chemical digestion taking place in order to convert the food that was on your dinner plate or lunch or breakfast plates that you had, and we want to convert them into the nutrients. The food itself, though, no matter how good it is and how tasty it is, it cannot be absorbed. It's just too big. You could have the most wonderful steak or chicken or fish or vegetable dish, whatever you like. You can't take it off your plate and kind of stick it into an artery or a vein in your arm. It's not going to fit in there. You can't take that broiled chicken and fit it in. We have to break the chicken down, the proteins in the chicken, into amino acids, which are the nutrients that we can absorb. If you had some good, you had some sourdough bread this morning with some organic butter on it, you're going to have to take the bread, the carb, and break it down into monosaccharides and then get those into the bloodstream. So the food we can absorb, but the nutrients can be absorbed. And that's the whole goal. If you can sort of keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through the chapter. Once we get into the introductory stuff, doesn't deal with this, but that's the whole goal. The goal is I got to get it into these nutrients that I can then send around the body. In Anatomy 1, I don't know when you had it, if you had it in the fall or over the summer or last spring maybe. Anatomy 1, you finished up with the cardiopulmonary system. So you looked at blood, the heart, the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and the respiratory system. And you saw in chapter 19 that the blood itself was involved in transportation, regulation, and protection. The transportation included transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide, which you looked at in chapter 23. You saw how oxygen gets into the blood, carried by hemoglobin, how carbon dioxide gets into the blood. It's transported around primarily as bicarbonate, but it dealt with that. But it's also involved in the transportation of nutrients and waste products. Well, how do the nutrients get in there? How do we get those nutrients into the bloodstream and then around the body? And that's what this chapter is going to deal with. Taking the food, and like I said, it could be the best food in the world. It could be something out of one of the vending machines here in the school. If you're not aware of it, the stuff in the vending machine isn't exactly healthy stuff that's in there, besides the fact it's so darn expensive. I mean, it's off the charts. There's a place near my house, I actually have a reverse osmosis system at home for water, but we also buy some water from a company that has reverse osmosis, and I get big 3-gallon jugs of water for $2 a jug. You say, go out to the vending machine, like $2.25 for a bottle of Dasani water, and I don't know about all of this stuff. So keep that in mind. So let's start to take a look at this, and we can start by taking a look at the organization of the digestive system. How is the digestive system organized? There's actually two headings that we have. We have the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract as one heading, and then we have accessory structures as the other heading. So one of these headings is what we call the GI tract, which just basically stands for the gastro, dealing with the stomach, intestinal tract. So the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract. I'm going to mention a term here only once. You'll never see it again. I'm not going to get involved with this at all. But there's another name. There's an older name called the alimentary canal. The alimentary canal is the old name for the GI tract. I'm not using it. I put it up there. A lot of you want to go toward nursing. I know a lot of the students, they may use the old terms from time to time. It's an old term. We don't use it. You'll find with any of you, when you go out and do your clinical rounds, you'll get older doctors like to bust your chops. They use older terms. They like to try to, it's an older term, but the alimentary canal was the old name when I was in college for the GI tract. GI tract's better, gastro, stomach, intestinal tract. And the GI tract actually has six different parts to it. It starts with the oral cavity or the mouth, which we're all sort of familiar with. So the oral cavity or the mouth is the starting point of the GI tract. I mean, you can think of the GI tract just as a hollow tube running through the body, and it starts at the oral cavity. Then we have the pharynx, You learned about the pharynx in Anatomy 1 a little bit. The pharynx is the throat area. Now, there were different parts to the throat area. I'm not going to get into it per se, but if you think about it, there's a nasopharynx area, there's an oropharynx, which is directly posterior to your mouth, and then there's we have a laryngopharynx a little bit lower. But again, the pharynx or the throat area. Then there's a structure called the esophagus. The esophagus is this food tube that basically runs from your mouth down to your stomach. We all live in the tri-state area. We're on the go all the time. If you've ever taken too big a bite of an apple or too big a bite of a piece of pizza crust or a bagel or something, you decided to swallow it anyhow, you get that nasty sort of feeling inside your chest going on. That's the esophagus pushing that food down toward your stomach. So we have the esophagus. Then we would enter into the stomach, obviously, would be the next part. We have something called the small intestine. And then the sixth and final part would be the large intestine. And we're going to take a look at each of these as we go through the next few lectures and take a peek at each of these, discuss the anatomy and the physiology there. Just of interest, and again, my handwriting's bad, isn't it, at the end? The small intestine is actually longer than the large intestine. It's double its length. When we get to it, the small intestine is about 10 feet long. The large intestine is only 5 feet long, but the name comes from the diameter difference. The small intestine is about 1 inch in diameter, the large intestine is 2.5 inches, and we'll talk about it when we get there. So those are the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract portion. And then we have what we refer to as accessory structures. Accessory structures are structures that are located along the GI tract. Let me make sure this thing doesn't disappear on me. It likes to do that. It locks me out. I don't know what it is with this system. Burning. It shouldn't be there, but we'll figure this out. Going way back to that. Let's go back to the beginning. Just gotta love this. Love the computers here. I just gotta love this stuff. Before we go into the very end of the sentence. Anyhow, accessory structures are located along this tube. They're not in the tube, but they're located along the tube. And a lot of them you're familiar with. 3 of them are located up near the oral cavity. We have the salivary glands. We have the salivary glands. We will talk about the individual salivary glands. Human beings happen to have 3 pairs of salivary glands, and we'll discuss them. Those of you that maybe have a feline or a canine companion at home, they have more salivary glands that we have. And some of you with the canines, some of them have big salivary glands, and they're always kind of drooling all over the place. They're cute anyhow, that's all right. So we have the salivary glands. The tongue is considered an accessory structure, as are the teeth. So these are all accessory structures located up in the oral cavity, and we'll take a brief look at each of these. And then if we get down into the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have 3 other features that we'll look at. The pancreas we'll discuss, not today obviously, but we'll take a look at the pancreas. That's an accessory structure. We'll take a look at the liver, which is the largest internal organ of the body. And then we'll take a look at the little gallbladder also, which is an internal structure that we have. So this is the way we break them down by their organization. Gastrointestinal tract, the tube that runs from the mouth to the anal area, and then we have these accessory structures. Also, I failed to mention, sometimes a student will have a question and they want to know, well, what about the colon? Where is the colon? The colon are different parts of the large intestine. So when we take a look at this about 4 lectures out, we'll talk about an ascending colon, a transverse colon, a descending colon, sigmoid colon. They're just different parts of the large intestine. We call it the colon. So we do have those areas. Let's take a look at some digestive processes. There's 6 of all of these things, 6 GI tract structures, 6 accessory structures. There's 6 digestive processes that take place in order for us to break the food down into the nutrients. Most of these occur at the same time. They can be occurring simultaneously. There's a couple that we want to function separately. One of the digestive processes that we have is ingestion, which is really just intake. It's when we put the food into our mouth. That starts the digestive process from the point of view of the body. We actually start digestion when you're cooking the food. So when you're preparing the food, I mean, you know, some of you have in your home in the kitchen, you have those big mouths, you beat the crap out of meat, and as you're doing it, you're tenderizing it. It's starting digestion. When you marinate something and let it marinate for a while, you're breaking down things in the meat or in the chicken, what you're eating, and you're, in a sense, going from that food toward nutrients. Cooking it in general, you can take a pretty tough piece of meat and stick it in a crock pot and leave it there for 12 hours and it'll be mush. I mean, it'll get soft. So, you know, it actually begins before that. From the point of view of our body, when we put it in the mouth, we begin the process of digestion. And then the second thing is that we have secretion. Secretion goes on all throughout the digestive system. We have secretion in the mouth. We make saliva. There's secretions of mucus secretions, the esophagus, the throat area. In the stomach, we will talk about, when we get to the stomach, gastric juice production. There's small and large intestinal juices that are secreted along this. I mentioned saliva already, pancreatic juice, there's bile from the liver, there's concentrated bile from the gallbladder. So we have secretion going on all through our digestive system, and we'll discuss it as we get to each of them specifically. Then we have mixing and movement taking place. There's mixing taking place, there's movement taking place. We need to mix the food with the secretion. So when we start in the oral cavity, you're producing saliva. We mix the saliva with the food we're eating with our tongue. We're chewing the food, also getting it all mixed together. In the stomach churns. I mean, we're familiar with that. If you've ever taken a test and you're a bit nervous, and you're sitting there taking, your stomach starts growling and people are looking at the muscles are actually, that's what they would normally do, mix and churn the food with the gastric juice. So we're doing that, and we're also pushing it along with movement. Some of you may be familiar with a word called peristalsis. Peristalsis, these are muscular waves. They're muscular waves. The muscles push the food along. Much like I mentioned, if you've taken that too big a bite of a pizza crust and swallowed it, and you feel it being pushed along, that's a peristaltic movement, pushing that food along from us. We have to push it from the esophagus to the stomach, push it from the stomach to the small intestine, push it from the small intestine to the large intestine. You're all adults, you all want to go into healthcare, you've all had gas at one time or another. You can kind of feel it moving along. You know when you're going to release it. You warn people, you better get out of here, and it's moving along, get closer to the other end. There's a movement that takes place, so we have mixing and movement occurring. Then we have the actual process of digestion occurring. Now, digestion, I had mentioned earlier when I said going from food to nutrients, there's really two types of digestion. There's mechanical digestion that we have. The mechanical digestion deals with the physical end of things, physically reducing the size of what we have. So this deals on that physical level. The best example and the simplest, there's many, but just for now, the best example would be plain old chewing. If you chew your food properly, chewing is an example of mechanical digestion. We live in the tri-state area. We eat on the go. You pull up to the window at Wendy's, grab your bag, and by the time you hit the street, you're done. You ate the double baconator cheeseburger and your fries. You're all finished. We kind of wolf it down really, really quick. But if you're chewing properly, our food actually should have the consistency of applesauce in our mouth before we swallow it. You've broken it down so much physically, you're allowing the enzymes in the saliva to begin to work on it. It makes it easier for the secretions of the stomach to work, but most of us don't. Most of us just kind of gulp it down like your dog. You put the food down. By the time you put your food down for your dog in the kitchen and run to the dining room table, he's sitting next to you already. He's eating and he's waiting for, what am I going to get now? So there's mechanical digestion, and we also have a chemical digestion. Now, chemical digestion would be just that. We're dealing with chemical bonds that we have in the foods that we're eating, and I can give you a little example. Some of you are familiar with something called sucrose. Sucrose is just the chemical name for table sugar, plain old white table sugar. It's not a big molecule table sugar. I'm not recommending eating a lot of it either, just using this as an example. It's table sugar. It's technically, from a chemical point of view, something that we call a disaccharide, which is not a big molecule, but it's too big to absorb. You cannot absorb it, it's just too big. Well, we do have in our small intestine an enzyme that we make there that's called sucrase. And the sucrase, the enzyme, breaks down the sucrose, and it breaks it down into two separate monosaccharides, which we can absorb. These are nutrients, monosaccharides, and it breaks it down into monosaccharides that I think many of you are familiar with, glucose and another one called fructose. So glucose and fructose are monosaccharides. So if you have something, I don't know, maybe you're drinking a bottle of, iced tea that has cane sugar in it, or you're eating a cookie or something, or a candy bar has sugar in it, well, the sugar is not real big, not a big molecule, but it's still too big for us to absorb, so we need to break it down chemically with a chemical digestion into two smaller molecules, glucose and fructose, which are monosaccharides. That's also one of the problems with they put all this high fructose corn syrup and things. It's already in the form of an absorbable monosaccharide. It screws around with our body's metabolism. We absorb it too fast. You want to slow it down. At least you're eating a sugar, a real sugar, you're going to slow it down a little bit. Now it's a little different with when you eat whole fruits. When you're eating a whole fruit, there's other components to it. So if you're eating an apple or a peach or a banana, there is fructose in it, but you're eating it and it doesn't get absorbed at the same speed. But again, a lot of people don't do that. They'll say, well, I don't eat the apple, I eat apple juice. Well, apple juice is basically sugar water. It's just, it's not really good. Most juices really are, unless you have one of those machines that the ninja thing, you throw the whole thing and pulverize it. It's again different. You're getting the whole thing. So that's down the chemical, the chemical level. That's digestion. That's the fifth process that we deal with. The fifth process is absorption. The whole goal is to break the food down from the food on our plate and to make it into nutrients, and then we're going to take the nutrients and hopefully we'll absorb the nutrients. Well, where do we absorb things? Absorption would involve the absorption of the nutrients now. We've got the food broken down by mechanical and chemical means, and we're going to absorb that food either into the bloodstream. Most of it goes into the bloodstream, and some of it goes into the lymphatic vessels. So, if you were to, don't do it, please. If you would go out in the hall and get a candy bar, I don't want you to buy a candy bar. Your parents will think I'm crazy telling you to eat candy in the morning. If you get a candy bar out there, before you know it, your blood sugar levels would go up. You'd break the sugar down into glucose and fructose, and your blood glucose levels would go up. You'd be absorbing those nutrients into the bloodstream. If somebody here has a hard-boiled egg for later, and you ate the egg, the protein in the egg will get absorbed into the bloodstream. It'll go up. Most things go into the bloodstream. Not all, but mainly the fats. Fats go into the lymphatic system. We absorb dietary fats, triglycerides, long-chain fatty acids, and such. Cholesterol molecules go into the lymphatic system. But again, and I don't know, some of the professors skip it in Anatomy 1, but if you covered the lymphatic system at all in Anatomy 1, once we clean the lymph fluid up, where does the lymph get dumped back into? It goes in the bloodstream. It goes back into the bloodstream. So in the long run, the fats end up in the bloodstream. It just takes a little different route. One of you took the George Washington Bridge across into Manhattan, the other one took the Lincoln Tunnel. You're both ending up in Manhattan, you're just taking a different route, you both end up there. So we have absorption taking place. And then lastly would be the process of elimination. And with elimination, we're going to get rid of undigested material and indigestible material. We'll get rid of all of that. Maybe you and I just know it simply as defecation. So as I said earlier, most of these run simultaneously. You can be secreting right now in your stomach, digesting your breakfast, but you can equally be secreting in the large intestine, getting ready to finish up with last night's dinner. We're mixing and moving it along. We have digestion going on, absorption going on. It's the ingestion and the elimination that we want to keep separate. Those are two separate things. We don't do those at the same time. You better not be eating a sandwich while you're going to the bathroom. That's not quite so healthy. in order to do that. So a little bit dealing with those different processes. So I want to take a look at a topic that I hate. I know my students hate it, unless you really were weird and like chapter 4 of Anatomy 1, dealing with histology, when you were learning about simple squamous and stratified cuboidal and areola and all of that. But we have to touch on a bit of histology dealing with the digestive system. And then I'll put up some pictures and we can take a look at some things. Histologically, if we look at the GI tract, now we're not talking about accessory structures, looking at the GI tract really starting in the esophagus area, and then going from the esophagus through the stomach, small and large intestine, we have 4 different layers that form the digestive system. Remember, your digestive system from your mouth to the anus, it's a tube inside your body. You can think of it almost like a garden hose inside the body, a flexible tube. And that GI tract is much like a garden hose. Don't do it. I have to always warn my students, but you probably have a garden hose around. Don't cut it. You know, your father wouldn't like it. But if you took a garden hose and you sliced it in cross section, you'd have the hollow part of it where the water's running. You'd have the lumen of it. But you have the green thing on the outside, and you look, there might be a white layer in there next, and then another one with black and white, and they cross. So there's different layers to it. Same thing with our digestive system. There are different layers to it. And I want to go through those layers because we'll lay out the basic way that it is, and then when we get to those areas, when we're studying them, you can say, well, this has a modification in this layer, and this has a modification in this layer. We can look at the little differences. So I'm going to start with the deep layer. The deep layer would be the one, this is the one that comes in contact with the food. It's the one that's on the inside, yeah.
Back to the digestion or absorption and elimination, I wanted to ask, is it true that actually when you wake up, it's better to wait like around an hour or some, like an hour or 2 until you eat or like drink coffee because it's...
Well, coffee is actually, well, first, you're supposed to in the morning, you probably should have something a little bit warm to drink, maybe like, you know, make yourself a little cup of green tea or something, kind of moves things along, get some liquid into the body, rehydrate, you get things moving along, and then you can eat. Coffee, I was reading an article recently, it was kind of interesting, they're talking about for most people, you should actually have coffee about an hour to an hour and a half after you're up to correspond with cortisol levels in your body. Yeah, so I mean, most people they wander in, you know, they're standing and they turn on the coffee pot and first thing they have in the morning. It's probably better to have it a little bit later on. There's always things that could change. But they're talking right now to waiting a little bit. Everything changes. But yeah, I don't think you just want to climb out of bed and make yourself a monster breakfast immediately. You give your body a chance, you know, to wake up, stretch a little bit, do some things in the morning, and probably better for your digestion. Get it going. So the deep layer. The deep layer is a layer that's referred to as the mucosa. Called the mucosa, it's sort of an abbreviation for the fact that it's a mucous membrane. Back in chapter 4 of Anatomy 1 in the tissue chapter, talked about membranes toward the end of the chapter. There were mucous membranes, there were serous membranes, synovial membranes. A mucous membrane, it lines structures that open to the outside. So if a structure is open to the exterior, it's lined with the mucous membrane. Our digestive system is open here, and it's open back on the other side. Our respiratory system is open to the exterior. Your urinary system is open to the exterior. The reproductive system opens to the exterior. They're all lined with mucous membrane, and even though it's the beginning of the semester and I'm boring the hell out of you and it's hot in here, you can guess, take a wild educated guess, mucous membranes secrete a lot of mucus. They secrete a lot of mucus associated with them, and our digestive system secretes a lot of mucus associated with it. So we have this mucosa. Now the mucosa itself has 3 subparts to it. The mucosa is made up of, first, a lining epithelium. Epithelial tissue lines or covers. The entire digestive system has a lining epithelium. If you could, and we can't obviously, if you could put your hand in your mouth somehow and down your throat and esophagus and through everything and it came out the other end, that would hurt. But everything that you would come in contact with would be a lining epithelium. And it varies. It's not for test purposes, but it starts off as a stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous, you'll remember, had many, many layers of flat cells found in areas where we want protection. We start off with that. The mouth is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. The throat is lined with stratified squamous. The esophagus is lined with stratified squamous, all for protection. If you're watching some college basketball now, which is fun, or you've been watching some football, if you're into that, and you're sitting there with your buddies, you're eating potato chips and pretzels and nachos and machos and cheese balls and all these other things, it's kind of scratchy going down as we're chewing it. We want to protect it. Then we get into the stomach, small intestine, most of the large intestine. It's simple columnar. Simple epitheliums where we have absorption going on because it's only one cell layer thick. And then when we get to the far end of the large intestine, down in the rectal anal area, it goes back to stratified squamous epithelium because we have feces. And if you're like any normal human, sometimes you have a normal bowel movement, other times you're maybe a little constipated, your stool's a little dry, we want to protect that area. So it will vary the lining epithelium. Epithelial tissue, since it's avascular, doesn't have a blood supply, so under the epithelial tissue we have something called the lamina propria. The lamina propria is a connective tissue layer. It's a small connective tissue layer. Connective tissue is very vascular, has good blood supply. So epithelial tissue is avascular, doesn't have blood supply. This has a blood supply, lamina propria. And then the last part of this mucosa is something that's called the muscularis mucosae. The muscularis mucosae is a very thin layer of smooth muscle. So there's actually three different parts to that mucous layer, the mucosal layer, the inner layer of our digestive system. You have the lining epithelium, which will vary. You have the lamina propria, which is connective tissue, and then we have the muscularis mucosae. That's smooth muscle. It's a little thin layer of smooth muscle that we have in there. From there, we can go to the next layer, working our way more superficially. We come to something, the name fits it perfectly. It's just simply referred to as the submucosa. The mucosa, now you have the submucosa, something under the mucosa, the submucosa. And this is a rather thick layer of connective tissue. It's a thick CT layer, this layer, and again, because it's connective tissue, it's quite highly vascular. It's highly vascular. One of the things that we had earlier was the absorption of nutrients into the bloodstream. We have to have a place to absorb it. And here's the blood vessels that we have over here. We can absorb them into this area. And I failed to mention something. You can kind of throw it in a sidebar. I apologize. Dealing with the mucosa. Part of this mucosal layer, and I do apologize, got ahead of myself. We have something that's referred to abbreviation-wise. We call it MALT. M-A-L-T, part of the mucosa. It refers to mucosa or mucosal associated lymphatic tissue or lymphoid tissue. There's quite a bit of lymphatic tissue along our digestive system. As a matter of fact, most of the lymphatic tissue of our body is actually located along in the walls of the digestive system. We just don't see it. There are certain lymph organs that we know. I mean, if I mentioned the spleen, you'd say, yeah, the spleen is the largest lymphatic structure in the body. The thymus gland is a lymphatic structure, but they're in one area. Most of the lymphatic tissue is actually found in the wall of the mucosa. A healthy lymphatic system will keep your body healthy overall. Through the years, I get to know my students over time. You'll find them quite chatty in lab class. I find, they're taking probiotics, they're taking prebiotics, they're trying to keep their digestive system healthy. They use, you use fiber, you get psyllium and stuff to have fiber in your diet and such. A healthy GI tract is a healthy body in general. You're keeping the lymphatic system functioning properly, and that's because we have so much of our lymphatic tissue located in the wall, diffuse, not in one place, spread out. But it does protect us. There's certain things that we can do to protect ourselves. You will find going into the healthcare fields, and I know many of you do work in hospital settings and stuff. You talk to people who work in hospitals, they'll usually tell you, get out of there as soon as you can. And it's probably the worst place to be if you're sick. And if you can stay out of the doctor's office as much as you can, probably the safest place to be, because they're probably the least educated. They spend a lot of money and time, but they're the least educated on actually keeping people healthy. They always deal with things after the fact. And so if you can do it yourself, you will find out as you proceed through your healthcare career that healthcare is not driven or directed by healthcare providers at all. It's really driven and directed by big pharma and by insurance companies. They dictate everything. They have such influence on everything. And we saw that, I mean, probably a lot of you looking at some of the younger faces, you're probably in high school at the time when we had all the nonsense back in, starting in March of 2020 or so. You never heard any doctors discussing how to stay healthy. You never heard a doctor on television telling you that if you got your vitamin D3 levels up over 50 milliosmol measurements, that you probably wouldn't get COVID and you certainly wouldn't die if it was high enough. But they didn't tell you things like that because number one, they don't know it, and number two, they don't really care because it didn't matter to them. I follow quite a few doctors through Telegram and through Substack, and I pay for a lot of these to get access to their things. It's quite amazing. I was reading an article by a former Health and Human Services doctor, PhD, Dr. Paul Elias Alexander, and he was discussing how he's probably one of the most censored doctors out there, with the guy on the level of Peter McCullough type of censorship. And he was talking about, he said, had we done nothing in 2020, just done nothing at all, he said, you would have had less deaths and less suffering and such. It did absolutely nothing. Everything that we did, which we know now was completely, if you've watched Dr. Fauci